When officials arrived to correct their clerical error, they froze at the sight of Nascha kneeling before the pale orphan boy, her tears falling onto his small suitcase as she whispered, "Please, he belongs with us now." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Chicago, Illinois. Winter 1885. The cough echoed through the narrow hallway of St. Mary's Orphanage, sharp and hollow, like stones striking frozen ground. Thomas Wilson, 10 years old and newly orphaned, pressed his thin shoulder against the peeling wallpaper and tried to disappear. His father's pocket watch, the only possession he'd managed to keep, felt heavy in his palm, its familiar weight both comfort and burden. Outside, snow fell in thick, relentless curtains, blanketing the city in silence. Inside, Sister Agnes moved from bed to bed in the boys' dormitory, her lantern casting long shadows as she checked foreheads for fever. Influenza had already claimed Thomas's parents 3 weeks prior, first his mother with her gentle hands and quiet singing voice, then his father, tall and solemn, who had lasted only 4 days longer. Now, the same disease stalked the hallways of St. Mary's, taking one child after another. "Wilson," Sister Agnes called, her voice firm but not unkind. "Come to the office. Reverend Mother wants to speak with you." Thomas clutched the watch tighter, his knuckles white. He knew what happened in the Reverend Mother's office. Children went in, and sometimes they never returned to the dormitory. They were sent away, to farms, factories, or households in need of small hands for labor. At 10, he was old enough to be useful. The Reverend Mother sat at her desk, spectacles perched on her nose, sorting through a stack of papers. Her office smelled of ink and furniture polish. On the wall behind her, a severe crucifix watched over the proceedings with hollow eyes. "Thomas Wilson," she said, not looking up, "you've been with us 3 weeks now." "Yes, Reverend Mother. We've received a placement for you, out west, Montana Territory." She finally lifted her gaze, assessing him with practiced efficiency. "A farming family, the Kents, good Christian people in need of help with their land. You'll leave on the orphan train next week." Thomas swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in his throat. Chicago was the only home he'd ever known. His father had worked at the rail yard. His mother had taken in washing. Their small apartment above the butcher's shop had smelled of soap and occasionally of the beef stew his mother made on Sundays. What did he know of farming, of Montana, of strangers who would own his labor? "May I keep this?" he asked, opening his palm to reveal the tarnished silver watch. "It was my father's." The Reverend Mother's expression softened for just a moment. "Yes, one personal item is permitted. Now go pack your things." Adieu, what things there were to pack, barely filled the small cardboard suitcase provided to him. A change of clothes, a worn Bible that had been his mother's, a wooden toy soldier his father had carved one Christmas, and the watch, which he secured in his pocket, the chain fastened to his buttonhole. 7 days later, Thomas stood on the platform of Chicago's Union Station, one of 23 children lined up with identical suitcases, waiting to board the westbound train. Snow still fell, dancing in the light of the station lamps. His new coat, donated to the orphanage and too large for his frame, did little to keep out the bitter cold. Sister Agnes moved down the line, checking names against her list. When she reached Thomas, she paused. "Remember your prayers," she said, straightening his collar, "and mind your manners with the Kents." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. The great iron beast of the train hissed and groaned beside them, belching steam into the frigid air. Children were already being ushered aboard, their faces pale ovals in the windows, some pressed against the glass in fear or fascination. "All aboard for points west," called the conductor. "Chicago to Omaha, Cheyenne, Helena, and all stations between." Thomas felt Sister Agnes's hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward. He clutched his suitcase with white-knuckled fingers and climbed the steps into the train car. Inside, the air was warm but stale, filled with the sounds of shuffling feet and muffled crying. He found a seat by the window and watched as the platform, then the city, the only world he had ever known, slipped away into the swirling snow. As the train gathered speed, Thomas pressed his father's watch to his ear and listened to its steady ticking. His father had once told him that as long as the watch kept time, he would never truly be alone. The thought brought little comfort as the Chicago skyline disappeared and gave way to the vast whiteness of open country. Through Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska they traveled. Days blended together, marked only by brief stops where stern-faced women from local aid societies provided meals and checked to ensure none of the children had fallen ill. Some children left at these stops, claimed by waiting families. Each time the train departed, there were fewer passengers, the car growing quieter with each farewell. Thomas tried not to think about the Kents or what awaited him in Montana. Instead, he counted the ticking of his father's watch and pretended sometimes that he was simply on a journey and that at the end of it, his parents would be waiting. But in his heart, he knew better. No one was waiting for him. No one had chosen him. He was simply being sent like a parcel to wherever he might be useful. By the fifth day, the train had crossed into Wyoming territory. The landscape outside Thomas's window had transformed from the flat farmlands of the Midwest to rolling prairies that stretched toward distant mountains. The other children had grown quiet, weary of travel, and anxious about their uncertain futures. Thomas spent hours watching the wild country pass, wondering what sort of place Montana would be. Miss Abigail Porter, the placement agent from the Children's Aid Society who had boarded in Omaha, moved through the car with her ledger. She was a thin woman with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that smelled of camphor. Her job was to ensure each child reached their designated family. "Wilson, Thomas," she called, consulting her notes. "You're for Cedar Creek. 2 more days." Thomas nodded, though the name meant nothing to him. Cedar Creek, Montana, a place that existed only as marks on Miss Porter's papers. He wondered if there were actually cedar trees there, or if it was just another empty name in this empty country. That night, while the children slept in their seats, Miss Porter sat at the rear of the car with the conductor, reviewing placements by lantern light. The train swayed and rattled over the tracks, making her handwriting slant across the page as she made notations beside each child's name. "The Kent family requested a boy of at least 12 for farm work," the conductor said, peering at her list. "This Wilson boy is only 10. Miss Porter frowned, shuffling through her papers. "The request form says 10 to 14 years. See here?" She pointed to the document with her pencil, but as she did, a drop of coffee from her cup splashed onto the page, blurring the ink. "Blast," she muttered, dabbing at the stain with her handkerchief. When she looked again, the destination written beside Thomas's name was no longer clearly legible. "I believe it says Cedar Creek," she said, squinting at the smudged writing. "Yes, Cedar Creek. The Kent family." The conductor nodded and made a note in his own ledger, unaware that on Miss Porter's original manifest, Thomas had been assigned to Cedar Ridge, a different settlement nearly 80 miles from Cedar Creek. Meanwhile, far from the rattling train, in a small settlement nestled against the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains, Nascha stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of crimson and gold. At 32, her face held the quiet dignity of one who had known both joy and sorrow, the latter etched more deeply around her eyes. Behind her, Kicha stoked the fire in their stone hearth. He was a man of few words but deep feeling, his strong hands capable of both tenderness and fierceness. They had built this life together, this cabin with its sturdy walls and carefully tended garden, this existence balanced between 2 worlds. They had left the reservation 7 years earlier, after the last miscarriage, 4 lost children in as many years had nearly broken Nascha's spirit. The medicine man had spoken of a shadow on her womb, a darkness that could not be lifted by tribal remedies. The agency doctor had been more clinical, mentioning terms like hostile tissue and incompatible blood, but the result was the same. There would be no children. Some in the tribe had whispered that it was because Kicha had taken work with the white settlers, learning their language and ways. Others said it was because Nascha had been baptized by missionaries as a child. The weight of these whispers, added to their grief, had become too heavy to bear. So they had come to this place, Cedar Creek, where a handful of Apaches lived alongside white settlers, Mexican traders, and a few free black families. Here, Kicha's skill as a tracker and hunter earned him respect, and Nascha's knowledge of herbal medicines was valued by women of all backgrounds. They had found, if not complete acceptance, at least a measure of peace. But the ache for a child remained, a hollow space between them that neither could fill. "The Thompson's baby will come soon," Nascha said in Apache, still gazing at the sunset. "Sarah asked if I would help with the birth." Kicha nodded, coming to stand beside her. "You should go. Your hands bring healing." "My hands," she replied softly, "bring everyone's children into the world, except our own." He took her hand in his, the calluses of his palm rough against her skin. "The Creator gives and takes as he will," he said. "We have each other." Nascha leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Yes," she whispered, "we have each other." That night, as snow began to fall outside their cabin, they lay together in the darkness, listening to the wind. Neither spoke of the emptiness that lived with them, as familiar as a shadow. Instead, they held each other close, finding solace in the warmth of shared breath and heartbeats. Miles away, the train carrying Thomas Wilson thundered through the night, its iron wheels eating the distance between what was and what would be. The boy slept fitfully, his father's watch clutched in his hand, unaware that his destination had been altered by a simple coffee stain, that fate or chance, or perhaps something more deliberate, had intervened to change his course. In the morning, when Miss Porter checked her manifest again, the smudged ink had dried, cementing the error. Thomas Wilson would not be going to the Kent farm in Cedar Ridge. Instead, the train would deliver him to Cedar Creek, where no family was expecting him, where no placement had been arranged, where Kicha and Nascha waited, though they did not yet know it, for a child who was not theirs by blood, but might be theirs by destiny. Cedar Creek Station was little more than a wooden platform beside a water tower, where the train stopped to refill its boilers before continuing west. A handful of buildings clustered nearby, a general store, a small church, the sheriff's office, and a saloon with peeling paint. Beyond these, modest homes and cabins dotted the landscape, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear Montana sky. When the train wheezed to a stop, Thomas pressed his face to the window. 2 days of mountain passes and narrow valleys had left him dizzy with the vastness of the country. This small settlement seemed impossibly fragile against the towering backdrop of wilderness. "Cedar Creek," the conductor called, moving through the car. "Wilson, this is your stop." Thomas gathered his meager belongings, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he stepped onto the platform, the cold air bit through his coat. Miss Porter consulted her ledger one final time. "The Kent family should be waiting for you," she said, adjusting her spectacles. "A farming family just outside of town." Thomas scanned the platform, but there were only 2 men loading mail sacks and a woman hurrying a young child toward the general store. No one looked like they were waiting for an orphan boy from Chicago. "Perhaps they're delayed," Miss Porter said with a frown. "We'll need to find the station master." The station master, a gruff man named Holloway, scratched his beard in confusion when they inquired about the Kents. "No Kents in Cedar Creek," he said. "You sure you got the right place?" Miss Porter's confidence faltered. She reviewed her documents again, squinting at the smudged ink. "It clearly says Cedar Creek," she insisted, though doubt crept into her voice. "There's a Kent family over in Cedar Ridge," Holloway offered, "about 80 miles northeast of here. They take in workers for their ranch sometimes." The blood drained from Miss Porter's face. "Cedar Ridge," she whispered, suddenly understanding the error. She looked at Thomas, then at the train, which was already building steam for departure. "We've made a terrible mistake." The conductor approached, pocket watch in hand. 3 minutes, Miss Porter. We need to be moving on." "This boy was meant for Cedar Ridge, not Cedar Creek," she explained hurriedly. "We need to take him back aboard." "Can't do it," the conductor said firmly. "We're carrying mail under contract. Schedule's tight as it is. Next eastbound train isn't until Tuesday." "That's 4 days from now," Miss Porter protested. "Can't be helped," the conductor replied, already turning away. "You'll have to find someone here to take him in until then." Thomas stood frozen, his suitcase heavy in his hand. The realization that no one was expecting him, that there was no family waiting, no place prepared, settled over him like a cold fog. Miss Porter's face twisted with distress and indecision. "I have other placements," she said finally, not meeting Thomas's eyes. "Children waiting in Helena, I can't." She straightened her spine, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Station Master Holloway, surely there's someone in town who can house the boy until Tuesday?" Holloway frowned, considering. "Sheriff might know. Or Reverend Simmons, though he's out visiting homesteads today." The train whistle blew, a sharp, urgent sound. "All aboard," the conductor called. "I have to go," Miss Porter said, pressing a dollar bill into Thomas's hand. "Wait here with Mr. Holloway. He'll find you a place. I'll wire ahead to Cedar Ridge and explain. The Kents can send someone, or you can take Tuesday's train." Before Thomas could respond, she was hurrying back to the train. He watched, numb with shock, as she climbed aboard and the great iron wheels began to turn. Within minutes, the train was just a smudge of smoke against the mountains, and he was alone with the station master in a town where no one knew his name. "Well, boy," Holloway said after an uncomfortable silence, "suppose we'd better see the sheriff." But Sheriff Davis was no more helpful than the station master. The town had no hotel, no boarding house. The church had no facilities for housing a child. And with Reverend Simmons away, there was no obvious authority to take responsibility for an orphan boy unexpectedly deposited in their midst. "What about the Indian couple?" suggested Mrs. Ellis from the general store when they stopped there. "The woman, Nascha, she's good with children. They live just beyond Miller's Creek." The sheriff frowned. "Kicha and his wife, they keep to themselves." "They're decent folks," Mrs. Ellis insisted. "She helps with birthing. He guides for hunting parties. They've got that nice cabin they built themselves." Thomas listened to this exchange with growing unease. They were discussing him as if he were a package that needed storage, a problem to be solved. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sheriff Davis finally made a decision. "I'll take him out to the Apache couple just until Tuesday. Nascha speaks good English, and they've got space in that cabin." Thomas was led to a horse, his suitcase tied behind the saddle. The sheriff mounted, then reached down to pull Thomas up behind him. As they rode out of town, Thomas clung to the man's coat, his thoughts whirling. Indians. He was being taken to Indians. The stories he'd heard in Chicago of scalping and war parties, of savages who attacked wagon trains, flashed through his mind. Fear gripped him, sharp and cold as the mountain air that burned his lungs with each breath. The sheriff seemed to sense his terror. "Don't fret, boy. These aren't wild Indians. Kicha fought as a scout for the army. They're Christians, or near enough. You'll be safe until Tuesday." But Thomas wasn't convinced, as the horse carried them deeper into the gathering dusk, toward a distant cabin where smoke curled from the chimney. He clutched his father's watch and wondered if its steady ticking would continue to keep him company in this strange and frightening place. The cabin appeared through the trees as darkness settled over the mountains. It was larger than Thomas had expected, with walls of hewn logs and a stone chimney from which smoke curled into the twilight sky. A small corral stood nearby, where two horses lifted their heads at the sound of the sheriff's approach. A garden, now dormant under winter's touch, stretched to one side. This wasn't the primitive dwelling Thomas had imagined. This was a home built with care and skill. Sheriff Davis dismounted and helped Thomas down. The boy's legs trembled, partly from the long ride and partly from fear of what awaited him. "Stay here," the sheriff instructed, approaching the cabin door. Before he could knock, the door swung open. A man stood in the threshold, tall and broad-shouldered, his long black hair tied back with a leather cord. He wore a flannel shirt and wool trousers like any settler, but his high cheekbones and copper skin marked him unmistakably as Indian. Dark eyes assessed the visitors with cautious curiosity. "Evening, Kicha," Sheriff Davis said, touching the brim of his hat. "Got a situation in town I was hoping you might help with." Kicha's gaze shifted to Thomas, who stood clutching his suitcase, trying to control his shivering in the cold evening air. Something flickered in the man's expression. Surprise, confusion, perhaps concern. "Come inside," he said, his English accented but clear. "Too cold for talk out here." The sheriff motioned for Thomas to follow, and reluctantly, the boy approached the cabin. As he crossed the threshold, warmth enveloped him, not just the heat from the fire crackling in the stone hearth, but a different kind of warmth that came from the careful order of the room. A hand-woven rug covered the plank floor. Shelves lined one wall, holding books, clay pots, and glass jars of dried herbs. A table of polished wood stood in the center, set with ceramic plates and a steaming pot that filled the air with the scent of stew. A woman turned from the hearth, a wooden spoon in her hand. Her hair, as black as her husband's, was braided and wrapped around her head like a crown. She wore a dress of deep blue calico, covered by a white apron. Like Kicha, her features spoke of her heritage, but her expression carried only gentle inquiry. "Nascha, we have visitors," Kicha said in English, clearly for the benefit of the sheriff and Thomas. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You are in time for supper." Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. "That's kindly, ma'am, but I can't stay. I've come about the boy." He explained the situation quickly, the mix-up with the train, the lack of accommodations in town, the next eastbound train due on Tuesday. Throughout the explanation, Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the floor, too afraid to look directly at the couple, too ashamed of his predicament to meet their gaze. When the sheriff finished, silence filled the cabin. Thomas could feel the weight of consideration in that silence, heavy as the mountains outside. 4 days, Kicha said finally. "The boy stays with us 4 days." "That's the size of it," the sheriff confirmed. "I'd take him myself, but with my wife away visiting her sister." He let the excuse trail off. Nascha stepped forward, crouching slightly to bring herself level with Thomas's downcast eyes. "What is your name?" she asked gently. Thomas swallowed hard. "Thomas Wilson, ma'am." "Thomas," she repeated, as if testing the feel of it on her tongue. "I am Nascha. This is my husband, Kicha." She gestured to the man, who remained by the door, his expression unreadable. "You've had a long journey," she continued. "Are you hungry?" Before Thomas could answer, his stomach growled loudly. Despite his fear, heat rushed to his face in embarrassment. The corner of Nascha's mouth turned up slightly. "That is answer enough. Come, sit." She guided him to the table, and Thomas found himself seated before he could object. The sheriff, apparently satisfied that the handoff was complete, backed toward the door. "I'll come by Tuesday morning," he said. "Take him to the station for the eastbound." He hesitated, then added, "Much obliged to you both." Kicha simply nodded and closed the door behind the departing sheriff. Then he turned to study Thomas, who sat rigid in his chair, still wearing his coat, his suitcase clutched between his knees. "You can put down your bag," Kicha said. "No one will take it." Reluctantly, Thomas set the suitcase beside his chair. His hands, now empty, trembled slightly. Nascha brought a bowl of stew and placed it before him, along with a chunk of cornbread. "Eat," she encouraged. "Food brings strength." The stew smelled rich and savory, nothing like the watery gruel served at St. Mary's. Thomas's hunger overcame his apprehension, and he took a cautious spoonful. The taste, venison, potatoes, and herbs he couldn't name, flooded his mouth, and before he knew it, he was eating with the desperate vigor of a child who had known true hunger. Kicha and Nascha exchanged a glance over the boy's bent head. Something passed between them, an understanding, a shared thought. Then they too sat down to eat, one on either side of their unexpected guest. As they ate, Thomas gradually became aware that they were not watching him with the suspicion or malice he had feared. Instead, there was a careful politeness in their manner, as if they were trying not to frighten him. He remembered the stories he'd heard of Indians who tortured captives, and wondered if this gentleness was a trick, if once he let his guard down, their true savagery would emerge. And yet, nothing in this tidy cabin with its books and handcrafted furniture suggested savagery. Nothing in Nascha's quiet movements or Kicha's dignified presence aligned with the tales of wild, bloodthirsty warriors. When Thomas had eaten every morsel of stew and cornbread, Nascha rose to clear his bowl. As she did, his hand went instinctively to his pocket, checking for his father's watch. The familiar weight was still there, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Kicha noticed the gesture. "What do you carry that is precious?" he asked. Thomas stiffened, afraid that naming the treasure might lead to its loss. But something in Kicha's steady gaze compelled him to answer truthfully. "My father's watch," he said softly. "It's all I have left of him." Kicha nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "The things our fathers leave us," he said, "carry their spirit. It is good that you keep it close." Thomas blinked, surprised by the understanding in the man's words. For the first time since entering the cabin, he looked directly at Kicha, seeing not the wild Indian of his fears, but a man whose eyes held their own stories of loss and memory. In that brief moment of connection, something shifted. Not enough to erase Thomas's fear or bridge the gulf of difference between them, but enough to plant a small seed of possibility in soil that just hours before had seemed too rocky for anything to grow. After supper, Nascha showed Thomas to a small side room off the main living area. A narrow bed with a wooden frame stood against one wall, covered with a colorful quilt. A chest for clothing occupied the opposite corner, and a small window, now dark with night, was set into the log wall. "You will sleep here," Nascha said, lighting a candle on the bedside table. "There is water in the pitcher if you are thirsty." Thomas stood awkwardly in the doorway, his suitcase still in hand. This room, with its clean linens and carefully crafted furniture, was far nicer than the crowded dormitory at St. Mary's. It was nicer even than his room in the apartment above the butcher's shop in Chicago. "This is your son's room?" he asked hesitantly. A shadow crossed Nascha's face. "We have no children," she said simply. Then, perhaps seeing the confusion in Thomas's expression, she added, "This room waits for guests. Now it waits for you." She showed him where to hang his coat, where to find more blankets if the night grew cold. Her movements were efficient but gentle, and Thomas found himself relaxing slightly in her presence. She wasn't at all what he had expected an Indian woman to be. "Rest now," she said finally. "Morning comes early in the mountains." When she had gone, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, uncertain. He was alone in a stranger's house, in an Indian's house, miles from anywhere familiar. The sensible thing would be to stay awake, to be vigilant against whatever dangers might come in the night. But the warmth of the cabin, the fullness in his belly after the good meal, and the exhaustion of days on the train conspired against him. Despite his fears, his eyelids grew heavy. He placed his father's watch carefully on the bedside table, where its soft ticking provided a comforting reminder of home. Then, fully clothed except for his shoes, he lay down on the bed, pulling the quilt up to his chin. He meant only to rest for a moment, to gather his thoughts and plan his next move. But sleep ambushed him, deep and dreamless, and he knew nothing more until morning light filtered through the small window. Thomas woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was. The sound of quiet movement in the main room brought reality rushing back. He was in Montana, in the home of Indians, waiting for a train that wouldn't come for 3 more days. He sat up, reaching immediately for his watch. It was still there, the silver case catching the early light. The face showed 6:30, later than he would have been allowed to sleep at the orphanage, but still early by most standards. After splashing water on his face from the pitcher, Thomas cautiously opened the door. Kicha was already gone, but Nascha moved about the main room, stoking the fire and preparing what smelled like cornmeal porridge. "Good morning," she said, looking up with a small smile. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied, surprised to realize it was true. He had slept deeply, without the nightmares that had plagued him since his parents' deaths. "There is food soon," Nascha said. "But first, Kicha brings water from the stream. Maybe you help?" Thomas hesitated, but the request seemed innocent enough. He nodded and put on his coat and shoes. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, the sun just beginning to touch the tops of the surrounding mountains. Frost sparkled on the bare branches of trees and on the dried stalks of last summer's garden. Kicha stood by the well, drawing up a bucket. When he saw Thomas, he gestured for the boy to approach. "In winter, we must break ice sometimes," he explained, showing Thomas how the well had a wooden cover to prevent it freezing completely. "Today, no ice. Good sign." He handed Thomas a smaller bucket already filled. "For washing," he explained. "Stream water is cold but clean." Thomas took the bucket, finding it heavier than expected. As they walked back toward the cabin, he noticed for the first time the careful arrangement of the homestead. The garden laid out in neat rows, the woodpile stacked with precision, the small smokehouse at a safe distance from the main building. Everything spoke of planning, of permanence. This was not a temporary camp, but a home built to last. "Did you build all this?" Thomas asked, curiosity temporarily overcoming his shyness. Kicha nodded. 7 years now. Before, we lived with the tribe near Fort Benton, but here is better, quieter. "Why did you leave?" Thomas asked before he could stop himself. Kicha was silent for several steps. Then he said, "Some paths are chosen for you, some you must choose yourself." He glanced down at Thomas. "Like you. Someone chose this path for you, yes? To go to Montana?" Thomas swallowed hard. "The Reverend Mother at the orphanage. She said I'd be useful on a farm." "Useful," Kicha repeated, as if testing the word. "A boy should be more than useful. He should be valued." The simple statement, delivered without emphasis or sentimentality, caught Thomas by surprise. No one had spoken of his value since his parents died. At the orphanage, he had been just another mouth to feed, another body to clothe. On the train, he had been just another placement to be delivered. But something in Kicha's tone suggested that being valued was different from being useful, that a person's worth wasn't measured merely by what tasks they could perform. The realization was both confusing and strangely warming, like the first ray of sun after a long, cold night. After breakfast, Kicha announced that he needed to check his trap lines in the forest. To Thomas's surprise, the man asked if he would like to come along. "Me?" Thomas asked, uncertain. "I don't know anything about trapping." "Today you can learn," Kicha replied with a slight shrug. "Or stay with Nascha. Your choice." The idea of venturing into the wilderness with this man he barely knew was intimidating. But the alternative, spending the day confined in the cabin, seemed somehow more daunting. At least outside, if danger arose, there might be a chance to run. "I'll come," Thomas said finally, trying to sound braver than he felt. Nascha packed them a small bundle of cornbread and dried venison. "Be careful of the North Ridge," she told her husband. "Snow is deep there now." Kicha nodded, accepting both the food and the advice with equal solemnity. Before they left, he gave Thomas a pair of leather gloves lined with rabbit fur. "Too big," he acknowledged, as Thomas's small hands disappeared into the warm depths. But fingers freeze quickly in mountain air. The morning was bright and cold, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air as they set off into the forest. Thomas struggled to keep pace with Kicha's long strides, especially when they began to climb. But the man seemed to sense his difficulty and adjusted his pace without comment. They checked a series of carefully laid traps, finding 2 rabbits and a marten. Kicha showed Thomas how to reset each trap, explaining the mechanics with patient precision. "Why do some have bait and others don't?" Thomas asked, watching as Kicha secured a trap beneath a fallen log. "Different animals, different habits," Kicha explained. "Marten follows curiosity, rabbit follows hunger. You must know what drives the creature you seek." He demonstrated how to tie specific knots, how to recognize animal tracks in the snow, how to move quietly through the forest so as not to alert game. Thomas absorbed these lessons with growing interest, surprised by Kicha's willingness to share his knowledge. "Did your father teach you these things?" Thomas asked as they paused to rest on a fallen tree trunk. Kicha nodded, his dark eyes scanning the forest with habitual vigilance. "My father was a hunter among our people. He taught me to read the land, to understand its rhythms." He glanced at Thomas. "Your father, what did he teach you?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He stared down at the oversized gloves covering his hands. "He worked for the railroad," he said finally. "He taught me about trains, how the engines worked, the different types of cars, and he taught me to tell time." His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket where the watch rested. He said being on time was a mark of respect. Kicha considered this. "Time is different here," he said. "In the city, minutes matter. Here, seasons matter. But respect, that is the same everywhere." As they continued their circuit of the traps, Thomas realized that the fear that had gripped him since arriving at the cabin was beginning to loosen its hold. There was something about Kicha's steady presence, his matter-of-fact acceptance of Thomas's company, that made it difficult to sustain the image of him as a savage or potential threat. They returned to the cabin in early afternoon, the trapped animals secured in Kicha's pack. Nascha greeted them at the door, her eyes quickly checking both for signs of harm or hardship. "Frozen?" she asked Thomas with a small smile, noting his red cheeks and nose. "A little," he admitted, but the gloves helped. Inside, the cabin was warm and filled with the scent of baking bread. While Kicha took the animals to the smokehouse to begin preparing them, Nascha instructed Thomas to sit by the fire. She brought him a cup of hot tea sweetened with honey. "It will warm you from inside," she said, taking a seat across from him with her own cup. "Did you learn much in the forest?" "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said, wrapping his cold fingers around the warm cup. "Kicha knows a lot about animals and trapping." "He is a good teacher," she agreed. "Patient. He would have been a good father." The words hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken grief. Thomas sipped his tea, unsure how to respond. Finally, curiosity overcame caution. "You said you don't have children," he ventured. "Did you ever?" "4," Nascha said quietly, her eyes on the dancing flames in the hearth. "4 babies that never drew breath. The last one nearly took me with him." Her hand moved unconsciously to her abdomen, a gesture so private that Thomas looked away. After that, the medicine man said my body would accept no more seed. Thomas felt a flush of embarrassment at the intimate nature of her words, but also a deep sadness. He thought of his own mother, of the lullabies she had sung while rocking him to sleep. He couldn't imagine her life without those moments, without him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Nascha looked up, her expression gentle but composed. "It is the path given to us," she said. "Each woman walks her own." After a moment she added, "And you have walked a hard path for one so young." Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in his throat. It was the first time since his parents' death that anyone had acknowledged the difficulty of his journey, not just the practical aspects of his placement. "Tuesday comes soon," Nascha continued, her voice careful. "The train will take you to this farm family. You are prepared for this work." Thomas hadn't allowed himself to think much about the Kent family or the farm that awaited him in Cedar Ridge. The prospect was too overwhelming, too final. But Nascha's question forced him to confront the reality that his stay here was temporary, that in just 2 days he would be traveling again toward yet another uncertain reception. "I don't know much about farming," he admitted, "but I can learn. I'm good with my hands. My father said so." Nascha nodded. "Hands that are willing to work will always find purpose," she said. "But a child should also find joy. Do you think you will find joy with these Kent people?" The question struck Thomas as strange. Joy had not been part of the equation when the Reverend Mother had arranged his placement. Usefulness, obedience, gratitude for the opportunity, these were the expectations that had been laid before him. The possibility of joy seemed like a luxury he had no right to consider. "I don't know," he said truthfully. "I've never met them." Something flickered in Nascha's eyes. Concern, perhaps, or a deeper emotion that Thomas couldn't name. But she only nodded and rose to check the bread in the oven, leaving Thomas to ponder a question that, until this moment, had never seemed important enough to ask. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the mountains sharp against the blue sky. Thomas woke to the sound of quiet movement in the cabin and the aroma of coffee brewing on the cook stove. When he emerged from his room, he found Nascha alone, dressed in a dark blue calico dress with a white collar. "Kichar has gone to bring more firewood," she explained, setting a bowl of porridge on the table for him. "We will go to church when he returns." "Church?" Thomas repeated, surprised. Nascha nodded. "Pastor Williams comes from Hickory Springs once each month. Today, he preaches at the schoolhouse." She paused, studying Thomas's expression. "You need not come if it troubles you." "No, I'd like to," Thomas said quickly. The prospect of seeing other people, of being in a familiar setting like a church, was oddly comforting after days of strangeness. Besides, Reverend Mother would expect him to attend services. After breakfast, Thomas put on his best shirt, still wrinkled from being packed in his small suitcase, and combed his hair with water. When Kichar returned, he too had changed into a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his long hair tied neatly at the nape of his neck. They walked the 2 miles to Cedar Creek, taking a path that wound through stands of pine and across a meadow now blanketed in snow. As they approached the settlement, Thomas could see people converging on the schoolhouse from various directions. Families in wagons, couples on horseback, individuals on foot. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden structure with a bell tower, serving as both educational facility and church for the small community. Inside, wooden pews faced a modest altar, behind which stood a tall, thin man with a grey beard who Thomas assumed was Pastor Williams. As they entered, Thomas became acutely aware of the eyes that turned in their direction. Some faces registered surprise at the sight of him with Keisha and Nascha. Others showed curiosity, and a few displayed something harder, disapproval perhaps, or suspicion. Keisha led them to a pew near the back, where they sat with Nascha between the two males. Thomas fidgeted nervously, uncomfortable under the scrutiny of the congregation. But Nascha sat perfectly still, her head held high, her expression serene. Keisha too seemed untroubled by the attention, his posture relaxed but dignified. The service began with a hymn that Thomas recognized from St. Mary's. When Nascha began to sing beside him, her voice clear and sure, he joined in hesitantly. Keisha did not sing, but his lips moved silently with the familiar words. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about the Good Samaritan, speaking of neighbors and duty and kindness to strangers. Throughout, Thomas was aware of occasional glances in their direction, as if the presence of an Apache couple with a white boy from Chicago somehow underscored the message. After the service, people gathered outside in the weak winter sunshine. Several approached Nascha, women with questions about herbs for winter coughs or remedies for chilblains. A few men nodded respectfully to Keisha, though Thomas noticed that no one shook his hand as they did with the other men. Sheriff Davis made his way through the crowd toward them, his badge catching the sunlight. "Widmore," he greeted Keisha, using a name Thomas hadn't heard before. "Boy settling in all right?" "Yes," Keisha replied simply. "He is no trouble." "Good, good." The sheriff turned to Thomas. "Got word back from Cedar Ridge. The Kent family's expecting you on Tuesday's train. Seems they've been waiting on a boy to help with spring planting." Thomas nodded, unsure what response was expected of him. The sheriff continued, lowering his voice slightly. "Folks say old Kent works his hands hard, dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. But he provides food and shelter, which is something in these parts." He cleared his throat. "Just so you're prepared, boy." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran through Thomas. The sheriff's words, though not unkind, painted a bleak picture of what awaited him at the Kent farm. Not a family looking to welcome a child, but a taskmaster seeking cheap labor. Before Thomas could dwell on this, a commotion erupted near the schoolhouse door. A boy a few years older than Thomas had shoved a smaller child who fell hard against the wooden steps. The smaller boy, no more than 6 or 7, began to cry, clutching his arm. While others stood watching, Nascha moved immediately to the injured child's side. With gentle hands, she examined the boy's arm, speaking softly to calm his tears. The child's mother hovered anxiously nearby, clearly torn between concern for her son and uncertainty about the Apache woman tending to him. "No break," Nascha pronounced after careful examination. "Only bruised. Cold cloth and arnica will help with swelling." She looked up at the mother. "I have arnica tincture at home. I can bring tomorrow." The mother hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Widmore." Nascha helped the boy to his feet, then turned to find Thomas watching her intently. "You know a lot about medicine," he said as they began the walk home. "Some," she acknowledged. "My grandmother was a healer. She taught me to use plants, to feel what is wrong inside the body." She glanced at him. "In the city you have doctors." Thomas nodded, remembering the brusque physician who had attended his mother during her final days, his clinical detachment as he pronounced her beyond help. "But they couldn't save my parents when the influenza came." "Some sicknesses are too strong for any medicine," Nascha said quietly. "When the white man's diseases first came to our people, many died. Even the strongest healers could not stop it." Thomas considered this shared history of loss, this common ground of grief that bridged the vast differences between their worlds. It made Nascha and Kicha seem suddenly less foreign, less other than he had first believed. That evening, as Nascha prepared supper and Kicha carved a piece of wood by the fire, Thomas sat at the table with a pencil and paper borrowed from Nascha. Slowly, carefully, he drew the pocket watch his father had given him, trying to capture the intricate engraving on its case. Kicha glanced up from his carving. "You have skill with your hands," he observed, nodding toward the drawing. "My father taught me," Thomas replied. "He said I might be an engineer someday, designing bridges or buildings." The memory brought both pride and pain. The future his father had imagined for him now seemed impossibly distant. Kicha set aside his carving and came to look more closely at the drawing. "This is your father's watch?" Thomas nodded, pulling the actual timepiece from his pocket to show the comparison. Kicha studied both with genuine interest. To make such a thing requires great patience, great understanding of how small parts work together. He looked at Thomas. "To see how things work. This is a gift. The Kent farm may not be the place for such a gift." The words, spoken without emphasis or obvious intent, nevertheless struck Thomas with the force of revelation. The sheriff's description of dawn to dusk labor, the suggestion that Kent was a hard taskmaster. How would such a life allow room for the dreams his father had nurtured, for the skills that were his inheritance? "But where else would I go?" Thomas asked, the question emerging before he could consider its implications. Kicha did not answer immediately. His eyes met Nascha's across the room, a silent communication passing between them that Thomas could not interpret. Then the Apache man returned to his carving, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said finally, "the path finds you, rather than you finding the path." That night, Thomas lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the banked fire, the soft murmur of Kicha and Nascha's voices as they spoke in their own language, the occasional creak of the log walls adjusting to the night's deepening cold. For the first time since arriving, he did not feel like a stranger in a foreign place or a burden to be tolerated until Tuesday's train. He felt in some small, indefinable way as if he belonged. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. To belong was to risk loss, and Thomas had already lost too much, yet as sleep finally claimed him, his last conscious thought was not of the Kent farm or the journey that awaited him, but of Nascha's gentle hands tending the injured boy, and Kicha's words about gifts and paths and finding one's way. Monday dawned with a sky heavy with clouds, the mountains obscured by a veil of grey that promised snow before nightfall. Thomas woke earlier than usual, a knot of anxiety tight in his chest. Tomorrow, the eastbound train would arrive, carrying him away from Cedar Creek, away from this cabin that had, in just a few days, become something like a sanctuary. He found Kicha already at work in the lean-to attached to the cabin's north side. The space served as a workshop, with tools hanging from pegs on the wall and wood shavings covering the floor. Kicha looked up from the piece he was carving, what appeared to be a small animal taking shape beneath his skilled hands. "Early riser today," he observed. Thomas nodded, watching as Kicha's knife revealed the form hidden within the wood. "What are you making?" "Fox," Kicha replied, turning the carving to show Thomas the emerging features. "Fox is clever, adaptable, survives where others cannot." He studied Thomas for a moment, then added, "Like you." The unexpected comparison caught Thomas off guard. No one had ever described him as clever or adaptable. At the orphanage, the sisters had called him quiet, obedient, sometimes stubborn, but never clever, never a survivor. "I'm not so clever," he demurred. "I just do what I'm told." Kicha shook his head. "No, you watch, you learn, you adapt." He gestured around the workshop. 3 days ago, you feared to be in this house. Now you help with traps, draw pictures, ask questions. This is adaptation. This is survival. Thomas considered this perspective on his behavior, finding it strangely empowering. He hadn't simply been enduring his unexpected detour to Cedar Creek. He had been learning, growing, finding his footing in unfamiliar terrain, like the fox Keisha was carving. "Would you like to try?" Keisha asked, offering a simpler piece of wood and a smaller knife. "Start with straight cuts. Wood will tell you what it wants to be." For the next hour, Thomas worked beside Keisha in companionable silence, learning how to hold the knife safely, how to follow the grain of the wood, how to envision the shape concealed within the raw material. His first attempts were clumsy, but Keisha offered patient correction without criticism. When Nascha called them in for breakfast, Thomas had managed to create something that, with considerable imagination, might resemble a sitting rabbit. "For first carving, very good," Keisha said, examining Thomas's work with genuine interest. "You have steady hands." The simple praise warmed Thomas more than he could express. He carefully placed the unfinished carving on the workbench, intending to continue later. Then the realization struck him. There would be no later. Tomorrow, he would be on the train, headed for Cedar Ridge and the Kent farm. This fragile connection, this peaceful morning of learning and creation, was ephemeral as morning mist. After breakfast, Nascha announced that she needed to deliver the arnica tincture she had promised to the mother of the injured boy. The weather was turning, she noted, and it would be best to make the trip before snow began to fall. "I'll come with you," Thomas offered, surprising himself with his eagerness. The prospect of returning to town had frightened him just days ago. Now it felt like a welcome opportunity to prolong his experience of this unexpected life. They bundled up against the cold, Thomas in his coat and the 2 large gloves Keisha had lent him, Nascha in a woolen shawl over her dress and sturdy boots. Keisha remained behind to repair a leak in the smokehouse roof before the snow arrived. As they walked, Nascha pointed out different plants, explaining which could be used for medicine even in winter. Pine needles for tea, rich in healing properties. Certain bark that could be boiled to reduce fever. Roots that retained their potency beneath the frozen ground. "My grandmother taught me to see the land as a medicine chest," she explained. "Even in the hardest season, the Creator provides what we need." "Is that why you help people in town?" Thomas asked. "Because the Creator provides through you?" Nascha considered this. "Partly," she acknowledged, "but also because healing makes bridges between people. When I help a white child with fever or a Mexican woman struggling to birth her baby, they see me as Nascha, not just as Indian woman. And I see them as people with the same joys and sorrows as my own people." Thomas mulled over her words, recognizing the wisdom in them. He too had begun to see Nascha and Keisha as individuals with their own stories, their own sorrows and strengths, not as the faceless Indians of dime store novels and frightening tales. In town, they delivered the arnica tincture to the grateful mother. Thomas noticed how Nascha gave clear instructions on its use, but didn't linger where she sensed she might not be welcome. Other townspeople greeted her with varying degrees of warmth or reserve. Some, like Mrs. Ellis from the general store, treated her with genuine respect. Others merely tolerated her presence with stiff politeness. As they were preparing to leave, Sheriff Davis approached, his expression serious. "Mrs. Widmore," he called, "glad I caught you. There's news from Cedar Ridge." Thomas felt his stomach tighten at the mention of his intended destination. "Had a telegram this morning," the sheriff continued. "The Kent place was hit hard by that ice storm last week. Roof collapsed on the bunkhouse where they quarter their workers. They're saying they can't take the boy after all, not till spring at least, when they can rebuild." The news struck Thomas with conflicting emotions, relief at the postponement of his placement with the apparently harsh Kents, but also a renewed uncertainty about his immediate future. "What happens to the boy now?" Nascha asked, her voice carefully neutral. Sheriff Davis scratched his beard. "Well, that's the question, isn't it? Children's Aid Society would want him placed somewhere suitable. But with the telegraph lines down between here and Helena, could take weeks to get new orders." He looked at Thomas, then back at Nascha. "I suppose he could stay at the jail for a spell, though it's no place for a child. Or perhaps the church." "He can stay with us," Nascha said quietly but firmly, "until new arrangements are made." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's generous, Mrs. Widmore. But are you certain your husband would agree? Taking in the boy for a few days is one thing, but weeks or even months—" "My husband will agree," Nascha stated with such conviction that Thomas could almost believe Kicha had already consented to the arrangement. Sheriff Davis looked skeptical but relieved to have the problem solved. "Well then, I'll wire the Children's Aid Society as soon as the lines are repaired. Let them know the boy is being housed temporarily with—" he hesitated, "with a respectable family in Cedar Creek." Udun. On the walk home, snowflakes began to drift down, melting as they touched the earth. Thomas kept stealing glances at Nascha, wondering at her swift decision to extend his stay. "Do you really think Kicha will want me to stay longer?" he finally asked. Nasha's pace slowed and she looked at Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "My husband may seem stern," she said, "but his heart is good. He sees in you something worth nurturing." "What does he see?" Thomas asked, genuinely puzzled. "A boy who has lost much but still stands straight," she replied. "A boy who is careful with his words but whose eyes show intelligence and curiosity. A boy who might, with proper guidance, become a man of substance." She paused, then added more softly, "The son we were never able to have." The words hung in the air between them, delicate and dangerous in their implications. Thomas felt a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the cold. When they reached the cabin, they found Kicha had finished the roof repairs and was now splitting wood with methodical precision, each stroke of the axe sending a log cleanly into two pieces. Nascha approached him, speaking in their own language, presumably relating the news from town. Thomas hung back, watching Kicha's face for any sign of displeasure or rejection. But the man's expression remained composed as he listened, asking only occasional questions. When Nascha finished, Kicha set down his axe and turned to Thomas. "So," he said, "it seems the Creator has given us more time together." There was no resentment in his voice, no reluctance, only a simple acceptance of changed circumstances. "Is it really all right," Thomas asked, "for me to stay longer?" "It is more than all right," Kicha replied, and for the first time since Thomas had known him, the Apache man smiled. A brief but genuine expression that transformed his usually solemn features. "It is as it should be." That evening, as snow fell in earnest outside, the three of them sat before the fire. Nascha mended a shirt, while Kicha resumed his carving of the fox. Thomas worked on his rabbit, making careful cuts under Kicha's occasional guidance. The domesticity of the scene, the quiet comfort of shared activity, created a sense of peace that Thomas had not known since his parents' deaths. Later, as Thomas prepared for bed, he noticed that Kicha had placed the finished fox carving on his bedside table next to his father's watch. The small wooden figure seemed to glow in the candlelight, its clever face alert and watchful. "A guardian for your dreams," Kicha explained from the doorway, "and a reminder that you too can adapt and survive." Thomas picked up the carving, feeling the smoothness of the wood under his fingertips. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the emotions swelling in his chest. Kicha simply nodded. "Rest well, Thomas Wilson," he said. "Tomorrow is a new day, not a day of departure." As Thomas lay in bed that night, listening to the soft hiss of snow against the window, he held both the wooden fox and his father's watch. One represented his past, the other a possible future. Both felt right in his hands, as if they belonged together, just as he was beginning to believe he might belong here, in this cabin between two worlds. The weeks following the news from Cedar Ridge brought changes to the cabin, subtle shifts that transformed three separate lives into something resembling a family. The guest room became Thomas's room, his few possessions arranged on shelves that Keisha built specifically for him. His rabbit carving, now completed and joined by several other attempts, sat proudly beside Keisha's more skilled creations on the mantel. February turned to March, and as the days grew incrementally longer, Thomas fell into the rhythm of life with Keisha and Nascha. Each morning, he helped collect eggs from the small henhouse and bring in firewood for the cook stove. After breakfast, he might accompany Keisha into the forest or assist Nascha with her medicinal preparations. In the evenings, he practiced his carving or read aloud from one of the books that lined the cabin's shelves, his confidence growing with each passing day. On days when weather permitted, Thomas attended the small school in Cedar Creek. The teacher, Miss Abernathy, was initially hesitant about accepting an orphan boy living with an Apache couple, but his quick mind and eagerness to learn soon won her over. The other children regarded him with curiosity rather than hostility, and within a few weeks he had formed tentative friendships with two boys his own age. "Peter invited me to fish at the creek on Saturday," Thomas announced one evening in late March, trying to sound casual, though his excitement was evident in his voice. "His father said he'd teach us to tie flies." Nascha looked up from the basket she was weaving, her expression carefully neutral. "That sounds like a fine opportunity," she said. "Peter is a good boy. His mother speaks highly of him." Thomas nodded, relieved at her approval. Then he hesitated, a thought occurring to him for the first time. That is, would it be all right if I called you something besides Mom when I'm with my friends? It feels strange to be so formal when—" He faltered, unsure how to express the changing nature of their relationship. Nascha's hands stilled on the basket. "What would you prefer to call me?" Thomas swallowed hard. "At school, some of the boys talk about their stepmothers. I thought maybe, since you're taking care of me now—" "You wish to call me stepmother?" Nascha asked, her voice soft but steady. "Or Nascha," Thomas said quickly. "If that's better, I don't know what the right word is for this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the cabin and the life they had begun to build together. Nascha set aside her basket and met his gaze directly. "Among my people, when a child comes to live with a family not their own by birth, they may call those who care for them Shima and Shijie, mother and father. It is understood that these names honor both those who gave life and those who sustain it." She paused. "You may call me what feels true to your heart, Thomas." Thomas nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The idea that he might have a name for this new relationship, a way to acknowledge what Nascha and Keisha had become to him without betraying the memory of his parents, felt like permission to fully inhabit this unexpected life. Later that night, Thomas overheard Nascha relating the conversation to Keisha in their language, her voice low but animated. Though he couldn't understand the words, he recognized his name and the terms she had taught him, Shima and Shijie. Keisha's response was brief, but Thomas caught the emotion beneath his measured tone. The couple spoke a while longer before falling silent, and Thomas crept back to his room, wondering what decision they had reached about his place in their lives. The answer came the following evening. Keisha returned from town with a package wrapped in brown paper, which he presented to Thomas with uncharacteristic solemnity. "For you," he said, "to mark your place in this home." Thomas carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a beautifully crafted leather journal. Its cover embossed with a design that combined geometric patterns and natural elements, mountains, trees, and a fox that resembled the carving Kicha had made for him. "So you may write your thoughts, your memories, your drawings," Kicha explained. "A man should have a place to keep what is important." Thomas ran his fingers over the cover, speechless with gratitude. Then he noticed something stamped in small letters at the bottom, T.W. Widmore. "My initials," he whispered. "But Widmore?" Kicha and Nascha exchanged a glance. "It is the name we use among white people," Kicha said. "Easier for them than Kicha Nadilehe, which was my father's name and mine. If you wish to use it while you stay with us, we would be honored." He paused, then added carefully, "But Wilson is a good name too. Your father's name." Thomas stared at the initials, understanding the significance of what was being offered, not just a temporary place in their home, but an identity, a belonging. "Thomas Wilson Widmore," he said, testing how it sounded. "I'd like that, at least while I'm here." The unspoken question, how long that might be, hung in the air between them. Though the Children's Aid Society had been notified of his temporary placement, the slow pace of communication and the bureaucratic complexities had resulted in no clear timeline for his relocation. March had stretched into April with no word from officials about his future. In truth, Thomas had begun to hope that they had forgotten about him entirely, that he might remain in this peaceful existence with Kicha and Nascha indefinitely. The Kent farm no longer figured in his thoughts, and Chicago seemed a distant memory, a life that belonged to someone else. But the outside world had not forgotten. One bright April morning, as Thomas was helping Kicha repair the chicken coop, they heard the approach of horses on the path leading to the cabin. Two riders appeared, Sheriff Davis and a stranger in a city suit that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop of the mountains. "Morning, Widmore," Sheriff Davis called, dismounting with a nod to Kicha. "This here's Mr. James Harrington from the Children's Aid Society in Helena, come to check on the boy." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He glanced at Kicha, who had straightened to his full height, his expression carefully neutral as he studied the newcomer. Mr. Harrington, a thin man with spectacles and a meticulously trimmed mustache, dismounted with less grace than the sheriff. He brushed dust from his sleeves before extending a hand to Kicha. "Mr. Widmore," he said with formal politeness, "thank you for your hospitality toward young Thomas during this irregular situation." Kicha shook the offered hand briefly. "It has been no hardship," he said. "Thomas is a good boy." Nascha emerged from the cabin, alerted by the voices. She wore her best dress, as if somehow she had anticipated this visit, and her hair was neatly braided. She greeted the visitors with quiet dignity, inviting them inside for coffee. As they settled around the table, Mr. Harrington produced a leather portfolio from which he extracted several documents. "I've been reviewing Thomas's case," he began, without preamble. "It appears there was quite a serious error in his placement. He was never meant to come to Cedar Creek at all." "We are aware of this," Nascha said calmly, pouring coffee into cups she reserved for guests. "The error was discovered when he arrived." "Yes, quite," Harrington agreed, adjusting his spectacles. "And while your willingness to house the boy temporarily was commendable, I've come to arrange his proper placement." Thomas's hands tightened around his cup. "Am I going to the Kent farm now?" he asked, his voice smaller than he intended. Harrington shook his head. No. The Kent situation is no longer viable. They've engaged other help for their spring planting." He shuffled through his papers. "I've located a suitable alternative, the Morgans, a farming family near Bozeman. They've agreed to take you on immediately. Good Christian people with experience fostering orphans." He smiled thinly. "We'll leave tomorrow morning." The pronouncement fell like a stone into the quiet of the cabin. Thomas felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath his feet. Tomorrow. After all these weeks of building a life here, of finding a place where he belonged, it would end tomorrow. "May I see the placement documents?" Kitcher asked, his voice controlled despite the tension evident in his shoulders. Harrington hesitated, then slid a paper across the table. "I've taken the liberty of completing most of the formalities. Given the circumstances, I thought it best to expedite matters." Kitcher studied the document, his expression unreadable. Nascha had gone very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Thomas looked from one to the other, desperate for some sign that they would protest, that they would fight to keep him. "Thomas," Nascha said softly, "perhaps you could show Sheriff Davis the rabbit you carved. It is on the mantel." Recognizing this as a request for privacy, Thomas reluctantly led the sheriff to the fireplace, though he strained to hear the conversation that continued at the table. "Mr. Harrington," he heard Nascha say, her voice low but clear. "Thomas has been with us for nearly 2 months now. He has settled well. He attends school here. He has friends." "Mrs. Widmore," Harrington replied with practiced patience, "I understand you've grown attached to the boy, but surely you see that this was never intended to be a permanent arrangement. Thomas needs a proper home, a proper family. What makes the Morgans more proper than us?" Kitcher interrupted, the edge in his voice betraying his usually careful composure. A heavy silence followed this question. Thomas turned just enough to see Harrington's discomfort as he cleared his throat. "Mr. Widmore, I meant no disrespect to your household, but surely you understand. A boy of Thomas's background, his heritage, there are considerations of cultural continuity, of appropriate upbringing." "You mean he is white and we are Apache," Kitcher said flatly. Harrington tugged at his collar. "There are many factors that guide our placement decisions," he said stiffly. "Race is but one consideration among many. But it is the primary consideration in this case," Nascha stated rather than asked. The official did not deny it. He simply shuffled his papers, retreating to bureaucratic certainty. "The decision has been made. I'll collect Thomas at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I suggest you help him prepare his belongings." He glanced toward Thomas, who was no longer pretending not to listen. "It's for the best, my boy. You'll see." As Harrington and the sheriff prepared to leave, Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not when he had finally found a place where the ache of his parents' loss had begun to heal, where he had begun to imagine a future. Just before mounting his horse, Harrington paused to address Kitcher once more. "I understand this may be disappointing to you and Mrs. Widmore. Your care for the boy does you credit. But I must do what is best for Thomas according to the policies of the society." Kitcher stood very straight, looking directly into Harrington's eyes. "What is best for Thomas," he said with quiet intensity, "is to be valued, not just useful, to be loved, not just housed, to be seen as a son, not as an obligation." Harrington had no response to this. He simply tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and followed the sheriff down the path toward town. When they had gone, Thomas turned to Kitcher and Nascha, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged, the word catching on a sob. "Please don't let them take me away." Nascha enfolded him in her arms, holding him as his mother once had when he was frightened or hurt. Over his head, her eyes met Kitcher's, a silent communication passing between them, determination, resolve, and something deeper that Thomas could not see but could feel in the strength of her embrace. "Listen to me, Thomas Wilson Widmore," Nascha said, her voice steady despite the moisture gathering in her eyes. "We will not abandon you, not tomorrow, not ever. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded against her shoulder, wanting desperately to believe her but afraid to hope too much. He had already lost one family. The prospect of losing another was almost more than he could bear. Keacher placed his hand on Thomas's head, a gesture of blessing and protection. "There are laws written on paper," he said, "and there are laws written in the heart. Tonight, we will find a way to honor both." Indeed, as evening deepened into night, Thomas sat at the table with Keacher and Nascha, watching as they wrote a letter by lamplight. They worked together, Keacher dictating while Nascha wrote in her clear, careful hand. Thomas did not ask what the letter contained or to whom it was addressed. He simply took comfort in their focused determination, in their refusal to accept that tomorrow must bring an ending rather than a new beginning. Before he went to bed, Keacher gave him a small pouch of soft leather. "Keep this with you," he said, "no matter what happens tomorrow." Inside the pouch, Thomas found a small carving, not of a fox or rabbit, but of three figures standing close together, their features simple but distinct. A family. "To remind you," Keacher said softly, "that some bonds cannot be broken by mere papers or words. Some bonds are written in the soul." That night, as Thomas lay sleepless in his bed, clutching the carving in one hand and his father's watch in the other, he heard Keacher and Nascha speaking in low voices by the fire. Though he couldn't understand their words, he recognized the cadence of prayer, a reaching towards something beyond themselves, a plea for guidance and strength in the face of forces that seemed too powerful to overcome. And despite his fear, despite the certainty of Harrington's documents and the weight of the society's authority, Thomas found himself joining in that prayer, not with words, but with the deepest longing of his heart. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Thomas had risen before first light, unable to sleep as the hour of Harrington's return grew closer. He dressed carefully in the clothes Nascha had laid out for him, a clean shirt, his best trousers, and the small leather vest Keacher had made for him, adorned with subtle beadwork along the edges. In the main room of the cabin, Thomas found Keacher and Nascha already dressed and waiting. Nascha wore her finest dress, a deep blue garment with white collar and cuffs, her hair arranged in a neat crown of braids. Keacher had donned a white shirt and dark waistcoat, his hair tied back with a leather cord decorated with a single eagle feather. They looked solemn but composed, like people preparing to face a storm with dignity. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Thomas could barely eat, his stomach knotted with dread, but he forced down some cornbread at Nascha's gentle insistence. "You will need strength today," she said, her voice steady despite the sadness in her eyes. As they finished their meal, Keacher placed the letter they had written the night before on the table. It had been sealed with wax and addressed to Judge William Harrison in Helena. "If things do not go as we hope," Keacher told Thomas, "this will be our next step. Judge Harrison is known to be a fair man. He will hear our case." Thomas nodded, though the idea of a legal battle seemed abstract compared to the immediate threat of being taken away that very morning. He fingered the small pouch containing the carving of the three figures, which he had tied to his belt beneath his shirt. Whatever happened today, he would keep this token close. At precisely 8 o'clock, they heard horses approaching. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as Keacher opened the door to greet their visitors. Mr. Harrington had returned as promised, but he was not alone. Beside him rode Sheriff Davis and, to Thomas's surprise, Reverend Simmons from the church in Cedar Creek. Behind them came a fourth rider, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in a manner that suggested both wealth and authority. "Mr. Widmore," Harrington said with a curt nod, "we've come for the boy." Keacher stood in the doorway, neither blocking entry nor inviting it. "You have brought many witnesses for such a simple task," he observed, his gaze moving from one rider to the next. The silver-haired man dismounted with the ease of someone accustomed to horses despite his fine clothes. "Mr. Widmore," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "my name is Edward Blackwood. I'm the territorial representative to the governor's office. May we speak inside?" Kicha's expression betrayed nothing, but he stepped aside to allow the men entry. Thomas, standing beside Nascha, felt her hand close around his in a reassuring grip. Once the visitors were seated at the table, an uncomfortable silence fell. Harrington cleared his throat. "Well then, Thomas, are you packed and ready? We have a long journey ahead." Before Thomas could respond, Blackwood raised a hand. "A moment, Mr. Harrington. I believe there are matters to discuss before decisions are made." Harrington's thin face registered surprise and irritation. "With respect, sir, the decision has been made. The society has determined the most appropriate placement for the boy, and I am here to execute that decision." "Yes, I'm familiar with your determination," Blackwood replied, his tone measured but authoritative. He turned to Kicha and Nascha. "I received your letter late last night. An impressive document, both in its composition and its argumentation." Thomas looked at Nascha in confusion. She had written a second letter. When? "I took the liberty of consulting with Judge Harrison before riding out here," Blackwood continued. "He found your petition compelling." Harrington's face had grown increasingly flushed. "What petition? I was not informed of any legal action concerning this case." "That's because it hasn't been filed formally," Blackwood explained. "Not yet. Mr. and Mrs. Widmore approached the matter with considerable foresight. They understood that the fastest resolution would come not through the courts, but through direct appeal to those with the authority to intervene." He glanced at Thomas. "And they were motivated by the desire to spare the boy unnecessary distress." Nascha spoke for the first time since the men had entered. "Thomas has suffered enough loss already," she said. "We wish to protect him from further uncertainty." Blackwood nodded. "A sentiment that does you credit, Mrs. Widmore." He turned to address Harrington directly. "The Children's Aid Society does excellent work, Mr. Harrington. No one disputes that. But in this case, I believe a mistake has been made." "Sir, with all due respect," Harrington protested, "the Society has established protocols for the placement of orphaned children. Thomas Wilson's situation falls clearly within our purview." "Indeed it does," Blackwood agreed. "But your own regulations permit exceptions in cases where a child's welfare would be better served by alternative arrangements." He withdrew a document from his coat pocket. "I've taken the liberty of reviewing the Society's charter. Section 12, paragraph 4 specifically allows for placement with families of good moral character who demonstrate exceptional capacity to provide for a child's physical, educational, and spiritual needs." Harrington frowned. "Yes, but I have here," Blackwood continued, producing another paper, "statements from Miss Abernathy regarding Thomas's excellent progress in school while under the Widmore's care. I also have testimonials from Reverend Simmons," he nodded to the clergyman, who sat silently observing, "attesting to the Widmore's regular church attendance and moral character, and from Dr. Matthews concerning Mrs. Widmore's valuable contributions to the health of this community through her knowledge of medicinal herbs." Thomas stared in astonishment. How had they gathered these testimonials overnight? Then he realized the letter they had been writing at the table was not their first action. Kicha and Nascha must have been preparing for this moment for weeks, quietly collecting statements of support, researching legal options, building their case piece by careful piece. Harrington's face had grown increasingly rigid. "Mr. Blackwood, while these endorsements are noteworthy, they don't address the fundamental issue. The boy is of European descent. The Widmores are Native American. It is the Society's policy." "That policy," Blackwood interrupted, his voice hardening slightly, is not enshrined in territorial law. And it is the law, Mr. Harrington, not organizational policy, that must guide our actions here. A tense silence followed this pronouncement. Thomas hardly dared to breathe, afraid that any movement might somehow tip the delicate balance of the conversation. Finally, Reverend Simmons spoke. "If I may," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I've observed the boy in church these past weeks. He is clean, well-dressed, respectful. He participates in services and has memorized several Bible verses for Sunday school." He cleared his throat. "More importantly, he appears content, at peace. This is no small thing for a child who has lost his parents." Sheriff Davis nodded. "Been watching the situation myself," he added. "Boy's thriving here. Got friends at school. Helps Mr. Widmore with his work, learning useful skills." He shrugged. "Seems to me that's what we want for orphaned children, a place where they can grow up healthy and learn to be productive." Thomas felt hope rising in his chest, a sensation so painful and sweet that it brought tears to his eyes. These men, even the sheriff, who had initially been so uncertain about leaving him with an Apache couple, were speaking for him, for his right to remain in the home where he had found belonging. Harrington looked increasingly isolated. He shuffled his papers with nervous fingers. "The Society's Board of Directors will need to approve any exception to established policy. I cannot simply—" "You can recommend the exception," Blackwood suggested. "With my endorsement and that of Judge Harrison, I believe approval would be forthcoming." His tone made it clear that this was not merely a suggestion, but an expectation. Thomas could remain silent no longer. "Please," he said, his voice small but steady. "I want to stay here, with Kicha and Nascha, with Mr. and Mrs. Widmore." He swallowed hard. "They've been teaching me things my father would have wanted me to learn, how to work with my hands, how to observe nature, how to draw and carve. They've given me a place in their home and in their hearts." His voice broke slightly on the last words. Nascha placed her arm around his shoulders, drawing him close to her side. "We cannot replace the parents he has lost," she said softly. "We would never try to do so, but we can offer him a home, an education, and love." She met Harrington's gaze directly. "Is that not what any child needs most?" Harrington looked from Nascha to Thomas, then to Blackwood and the others. The certainty that had fueled his mission seemed to be evaporating in the face of their united opposition. "I will need to consult with my superiors," he said finally. "But I suppose, given the unusual circumstances and the apparent support of territorial officials, a temporary continuation of the current arrangement could be permitted. Pending final approval, of course." Blackwood smiled thinly. "I believe that is a sensible approach, Mr. Harrington, and I would be happy to accompany you back to Helena to speak directly with your superiors about the matter." Something in his tone suggested that this was not an offer Harrington could refuse. The Children's Aid Society representative nodded stiffly. "Very well. In the meantime, the boy will remain here." He turned to Kicha and Nascha. "I will require regular reports on his welfare and education." "You will have them," Kicha assured him with dignity. As the visitors prepared to leave, Thomas felt light-headed with relief. He wasn't being taken away. Not today, perhaps not ever, if Blackwood's intervention proved as effective as it seemed it might be. Just before departing, Blackwood paused to speak privately with Kicha and Nascha. Thomas couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Nascha grasp the official's hand in gratitude and Kicha bow his head in a gesture of profound respect. When they had gone, the cabin seemed suddenly quieter, the air clearer somehow, as if a storm had passed. Thomas looked at Kicha and Nascha, these two people who had fought so hard to keep him with them. "You planned this," he said, not as an accusation, but in wonder. All of it. Nascha smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Not all. We could not plan for Mr. Blackwood's support. That was unexpected blessing. We planned only to fight for what matters, Kitcha added simply, for family. The word hung in the air between them, precious and new. Family. Not by blood, not by law yet, but by choice and love and shared life. Thomas moved forward and, for the first time, embraced them both, these people who had taken in a stranger and found in him a son. As their arms encircled him, he felt the last piece of his fractured world finally slide into place. 2 years later, on a bright June morning, Thomas stood beside Kitcha in the churchyard of Cedar Creek. Both wore their Sunday best, though Kitcha's attire included a traditional beaded belt that had belonged to his father. Reverend Simmons stood before them, Bible in hand, while the small congregation, a mix of white settlers, Mexican families, and the few Apache who had followed Kitcha and Nascha's example of building lives in the borderlands between cultures, watched with varying degrees of emotion. At the front of the gathering sat Edward Blackwood, now a judge himself, his presence lending official weight to the proceedings. Beside him sat a representative from the Children's Aid Society, not Harrington, who had been transferred to an Eastern office, but a younger, more progressive woman who had worked tirelessly to revise the Society's policies regarding cross-cultural placements. Thomas, now 12, shifted nervously from foot to foot. The papers in his pocket, the formal adoption decree signed by Judge Harrison the previous week, crinkled with each movement. The church door opened, and Nascha appeared, radiant in a dress of pale blue, her hair adorned with small white flowers. She walked slowly to join them, and as she took her place beside Kitcha, Thomas saw tears shining in her eyes. Tears not of grief, but of joy. Reverend Simmons cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today not only to witness the legal adoption of Thomas Wilson Widmore by Kitcha and Nascha Widmore, an adoption already blessed by the territorial court, but to ask God's blessing upon this family, formed not by blood but by love." The service was brief but meaningful, incorporating elements of Christian tradition alongside Apache prayers that Kitcha spoke in his native tongue, translated by Nascha for the congregation. When it concluded, Reverend Simmons invited the three of them to speak the vows they had prepared. Kitcha went first, his voice deep and clear in the hushed church. "I, Kitcha Widmore, take you, Thomas Wilson Widmore, as my son. I promise to guide you with wisdom, to protect you with strength, and to love you with an open heart. Your path is my path. Your future is my hope." Nascha followed, her English precise and melodic. "I, Nascha Widmore, take you, Thomas Wilson Widmore, as my son. I promise to nurture your spirit, to tend your wounds, and to celebrate your joys as my own. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, as my people are now yours." Then it was Thomas's turn. He had practiced these words countless times, determined not to falter at this crucial moment. "I, Thomas Wilson Widmore, take you, Kitcha and Nascha Widmore, as my father and mother." His voice grew stronger with each word. "I promise to honor your teachings, to respect your traditions, and to carry your names with pride. I will remember those who gave me life, even as I embrace the life we build together." After the final prayer, as the congregation rose to congratulate the newly blessed family, Thomas withdrew 2 objects from his pocket, his father's silver watch and the small wooden carving of 3 figures that Kitcha had made him on that fateful night 2 years ago. "I want you to have this," he said, placing the watch in Kitcha's palm. "My father would want you to have it, to remember that time is precious and that being on time is a mark of respect." Kitcha's fingers closed around the watch, his expression solemn with understanding of the gift's significance. "I will treasure it," he promised. To Nascha, Thomas gave the carving. "You kept your promise," he said simply. "You didn't abandon me. Not then, not ever." Nascha took the small wooden family in her hands, cradling it as tenderly as if it were a living thing. "The Creator has strange and wonderful ways," she said softly. "He sent you to the wrong cabin, Thomas Wilson Widmore, but to the right home." As they walked out of the church into the Montana sunshine, Thomas, between Kicha and Nascha with their hands on his shoulders, he knew that his life had been shaped by an error, a simple coffee stain on a manifest, a misread destination, but from that error had grown something true and lasting. He was Thomas Wilson Widmore now, son of parents lost to illness in Chicago, but also son of Kicha and Nascha, who had found in him the child their bodies could not create, but their hearts had always sought. He carried within him two worlds, two traditions, two names, not divided but multiplied. And as they reached the wagon that would carry them home to the cabin between worlds, Thomas looked up at the mountains that had witnessed his journey from frightened orphan to beloved son, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be.